back, everybody, for the second lecture. Before I continue, I just want to make sure I am visible, I am audible, there's nothing bothering, I can go ahead. Right, okay. So I just wanted to talk to the student cohort for a moment before I start the lecture and say, well, yesterday we had to do all the official things, and it was Professor this and Professor that, and wonderful this and wonderful that. But I think today we should probably want to forget about all those formalities and just come out and play academia. I'm inviting you to play with me, to explore, to ask questions, to counter, to fight if you need to. There's always the saying that there's no stupid question, and it's not as simple as that. There are stupid questions, but let me be the judge of that. Don't decide for yourself that your question is stupid. I might say to you, this is a stupid question if I really want to be rude, and then one day when you've proven me wrong, then you can say, I have it on record that he said it was a stupid question, and look where it got me, right? So this is just my way of trying to invite you. Don't decide for yourself whether it's a stupid question. Ask it, and then we'll take it from there. Right, so I'm looking forward to engaging with you in this lecture. I just want to share stuff. Jack, there's a bit of a ghost sound in my ear. It might be a...
Yeah. No, I heard it as well. It's possible that it's someone's microphone is not muted. So I think everyone's muted now, so we shouldn't have a problem.
Yeah, it's gone now. Okay, thanks. Right, so ladies and gentlemen, I closed yesterday by saying that if we are looking, or if we are working towards ecologically sensitive translation studies, if that is our goal, or I said that as our goal yesterday, and the question then today is, what kind of onto-epistemology do we need to achieve that goal? How should we think about knowing and about the world in which we are, about being, to achieve the goal of ecologically sensitive translation studies? And I want to start off by sharing two quotes with you. The one is by the late Giorgio Prodi, who was an Italian oncologist, but he wrote some really deep semiotic philosophical thoughts about the material basis of meaning and how the worlds of meaning and matter fit into one another. So one of the things that he said is that the world, whether that be the real world or possible worlds in which semiosis occurs, is not an area detachable from reality, right? Semiosis isn't meaning making, and hence translation, isn't something that happens loose or separate from the material reality. It is also not, he says there, confined to the human world. It is not something that happens in the human world only. Rather, he says it is the world which is open before us, indefinitely extended beyond what we see, that we can talk about, that we can engage with. So I think he states the principle that when we want to think about meaning making, as I tried to indicate with my example of the finger yesterday, we need to think matter and semiosis as one thing. It's not separate things where you can study meanings detached from the real world. In 2020, the eco-semiotician Timo Moran wrote a very influential book on ecology, semiotics and ecology. And he criticized in this book what he calls the predominantly symbolic perspective, or he calls it symbolocentrism, where we think that the symbols that we use in culture are self-sufficient and closed off, right? So literature can be studied as a system without reference to anything else. Painting can be studied as a system without reference to anything else, or at least without reference to any materiality. Music can be studied in that way. He says, but the problem then is if we think of the cultural idea world in which we live as the self-sufficient closed system, then there's no negative feedback. The world cannot tell us that we're wrong because we have cut ourselves off from the world. And therefore, these views have limited capacities for developing interactions with the object level of the environment. So it's basically positing culture as a superstructure on top and semi-detached from the material, energetic, biological ecosystems that it forms part of. And therefore, he says the hegemony of symbols has a tendency to bring along antagonism and semiocide, killing meanings. So if that is not where we want to be, if we don't want to think of translation as playing out in a world of symbols only with no relevance to matter and energy, again, the question then is what kind of onto epistemology do we need? And in the first place, I think I need to make an argument for the fact that we do need an onto epistemology and not only epistemology. So the famous physicist and gender studies specialist Karen Barrett said that as much as constructivism and idealism, constructivism specifically, has given us powerful tools to criticize power abuse and to do critical analysis, it has put too much emphasis on the constructing part. In other words, the epistemology. I create knowledge by constructing it. I make it, and too little attention is paid to co-constructivism, where the things that we know co-construct the way in which we know them, which can very easily be seen as a positivist outlook on life, but I don't think it needs to be. So I follow Barrett's criticism that we cannot reduce work in the humanities to constructivism only. We need a kind of realism, a kind of onto epistemology, also talking about reality. But I don't follow all of her solutions, and I'll show you in time where we would differ. I do then agree that we need this ontology. So before I go into the detail of epistemology and ontology, I quickly wanted to provide clarity on some of the terminology. So complexity theory is the term that is used mostly in the natural sciences for quantitative natural science dominated applications and uses of the notion of complexity and understandings of the notion of complexity. So it's pretty much a kind of it's very technical and it's very quantitative. Then you also have, for instance, in the work of Paul Slier, who's a fellow South African, he developed, and Edgar Morin is another example. They developed philosophies of complexity, right? So you can use complexity as a kind of theoretical framework. You can use it as a philosophy that just kind of informs the way in which you engage with your topics. And then Reine and I, in our thinking about these things, sort of came to the point where we said, what we are trying to do is probably what we call complexity thinking. It's not complexity theory in the quantitative sense, and it's probably also not a theory, even if it's qualitative. And it's probably also not deep philosophy, although it has some philosophical implications. So we're just talking about complexity thinking. So just to make that clear to you. So I'm going to run now through a few of the features of complex epistemology, and then we will move. Then I will move into 3 key concepts that I would like to explain to you that you could use in your research, and then we will move on to ontology to create onto epistemology. Right. So to understand complexity first, you need to understand that in the 1800s, when complexity theory started to be developed, the dominant epistemology was the Newtonian worldview, where the world operated according to fixed laws, and the laws were operative everywhere in the world. And things were caused basically by bumping into one another. So you would, this is called the billiard ball model of causality. Imagine on a billiard table, the one ball rolls, it hits another ball, and that ball then skids off in some kind of direction. So it's a kind of a bumping model of causality. But in the middle of the 19th century, in physics, mathematics, biology, and specifically later thermodynamics with Ludwig Boltzmann and people like him, realized that the kind of linear logic that Newton assumed doesn't work actually in most of the cases, even in physics, doesn't work that way. In thermodynamics, there are so many collisions between particles that it doesn't help you to try and calculate them all. So you have to have other ways of thinking about the how things are caused. Just a quick historical overview. So after the initial conceptualizations in the latter 19th century, then in the first half of the 20th century, we have the development of emergence theory, mostly by British scholars, to explain that the development of things are not linear in that one thing follow upon the other. Rather, you have kind of breaks and jumps between things, and then all of a sudden in that break, new properties emerge. So there's still some problems with the theory, but it explains quite a bit. Then in the 1980s, chaos theory became popular. You would know chaos theory from the adage that says the butterfly claps its wings in Brazil and it causes a typhoon in China or wherever, right? So it's small changes can have catastrophic effects. Chaos theory didn't last very long because it was an oversimplification. So in the 1990s, complex adaptive systems, to which I referred yesterday, CAS, developed, and that is what we have these days. And complex adaptive systems theory, or complexity theory then, was made possible primarily through computational power, because the kind of calculations that you need to do are so complex that human beings basically can't do them, and they can only be done computationally. So it's no coincidence that the 1980s and 90s, when computers became popular, was also caused a massive growth in complexity thinking. And then obviously also with the development in the 20th century of probability theories, which mathematicized some of the complexity issues. Right. So firstly, as a feature of complexity, causality in complex adaptive systems is nonlinear. That means that in a complex adaptive system, 1 + 1 doesn't make 2, right? Or in a language setting, black and pudding doesn't necessarily mean a black sweet dessert, right? The putting two things together could have really weird and unexpected outcomes, and not just adding them up. This is what we say, what we mean when we say the sum of the parts are bigger than the parts themselves, right? The whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. Yes, that was what I was thinking about. So this means that because one thing doesn't cause another thing directly, but could cause many things or could cause fewer things than one expected, it means that complex adaptive systems are sensitive to initial conditions. And in translation studies, interlingual translation, we know this. Depending on the brief with which you start your translation, you might get completely different translations, right? It's something that we really know, but the sensitivity means that unexpected things can happen, which you cannot really predict. A third feature of complex adaptive systems is that they self-organize. So in something like a literary system or traffic as a system, there's no organizer. Even the traffic cops that try to organize traffic probably most of the time fail to do so. The system itself organizes itself. And that's one of the things I think might be helpful in translation studies, because we tend to think that everything has an agent. Translation studies is quite focused on agents, and I think maybe we will see interesting things if we start thinking about the self-organization of translational systems. Complex adaptive systems operate at the edge of chaos is the technical term, and what that means is that they are somewhat stable and somewhat unstable at the same time. Typically, effective systems are more unstable than they are stable. But if they are completely unstable, it's chaos. So it's at the edge of chaos, not chaotic, where you want a system to be. And that means that systems that are overly stable tend to die or stagnate and not produce what they should produce. The implications of all the above is that effects in complex adaptive systems are unpredictable, and I have to add, to various extents. I think there are some complete unpredictability, and then there are some with probability theories and stochastic maths and all these kinds of things. You can make some predictions, but the fact that the causality doesn't work from one thing to another thing, but from many things to many things, or from one thing to many things, or from many things to one thing, and the fact that it doesn't have a linear cause, means that it's really difficult to predict. And you can just imagine, if you gave 5 people a Shakespeare text to translate, it's probably unpredictable what the outcomes would be. Or you could guess to some extent, but you wouldn't have it perfectly predicted, right? One of the important things that happened in complex adaptive systems, especially in the 1800s and later through the work of Ilya Prigogine in the 20th century, is that time became a relevant factor in complex adaptive systems. For Newton, time didn't make any difference. Whether you translate it forward or backwards, for Newton wouldn't make a difference. Whether the ball moves from here to there or from there to here, it's pretty much the same, and you can reverse it by just applying a reversed force. But in complex adaptive systems, it's not, and we know this through back translations. You can, again, give 5 people a text to back translate, and you will not get the same text back as the source text, the original text was, right? Simple laws may generate complex behavior. this is probably more for the natural sciences. I'm not sure that in the humanities and cultural studies we have simple laws, but we may have simplified trajectories about which I will speak in a moment. A very important point is that complex adaptive systems are typically seen as hierarchically organized. So you know probably about hierarchies where one thing is built on top of another, and the top thing is the most important, right? So people could view our world as hierarchical, and then materiality is the base, and it's the least important, and humanities are the top, and humans are the top, and they're the most important. But what complexity theory, I think, suggests, and I will also get back to this, is that yes, you have a world based on systems, but the systems are nested into one another, right? And they are not, it's not a hierarchy, it's differences and similarities that link them together. And out of these, you get the emergence of new forms. So I will show you my ontology at the end, or onto epistemology at the end, how I use this hierarchical structure to explain that. An important thing is that emergent properties constrain the parts from which they emerged. So once something has emerged as a whole, that whole now constrains how the parts can emerge. And here we can think about a culture. At some point, a culture emerges and it becomes a kind of overarching conceptual scheme for people to live in. And that constrains how people can then act, right? So in a particular culture, you couldn't challenge authority. So the emergence of that, let's say, higher level or another level of meaning making constrains the parts and causes the parts to do fewer things than they could have done. This is a kind of a paradox that actually the whole is quite often less than the parts, because the parts have many more possibilities often than the whole. Right. Just as a technical one, these days there are fantastic simulations, and if some of you are technologically inclined, I think there's great scope to try and develop apps and software that can also help us model translation processes on computers. And then the last point is that I think if we say that we have good evidence to say that our world is complex, then we should have complex answers or complex explanations to that world. So reductionist explanations would be to take one part of a problem and answer it and then think that you've answered the whole problem. And I think complex adaptive systems theory, complexity thinking, what we are trying to do, tries to go for as complex as possible answers and as complex as needed answers. Right. So now I'm going to move to explaining three key concepts of a complex epistemology, and hopefully that should help you if you would like to use that for research. So I've asked a number of times yesterday, how do things come to be? And by things, I mean material things, and I mean cultural things, and I mean ideas, and I mean feelings, and I mean live bodies. Things are generally things. So what we know from physics is that things only become when work is performed. Things only become when there's energy to do things with and to make things with. Now, I'm not going to go into the physics. If you want to read up on this, Terence Deacon's book, Incomplete Nature, has long chapters on this, which would help you understand this. The point that I would like to make is that what complexity thinking gives us is the notion of emergence. And emergence doesn't mean that let me put it this way. The emergence of new stuff, new things, doesn't mean that new matter has been created. Quite often, new things emerge because the same old stuff, the same old parts have been organized in new ways. I used the example of carbon yesterday, which can be organized to be graphite, and it can be organized to be coal, and it can be organized to be diamonds. So what we are focusing on is not the stuff, but the way in which the stuff is organized, which means the way in which they are put in relationship to one another. Again, in interlingual translation, this is something that I think we probably know, in that the same words can be used to create two completely different poems. I can take 10 words and use them in different ways. In other words, create different relationships between them, organize them differently. And then something new emerges out of that new organization. So I think one of the things we want to study from a complexity perspective is how the processes and the details of how things are organized in new ways to make new things come about. The second term that I would like to explore a bit is the notion of an attractor. So in complexity theory, there's the notion of a basin of attraction. Now, the easiest way to explain this to you is to ask you to imagine it raining. If it rains 100 millimeters, you don't have a covering of 100 millimeters of water throughout the country. So let's say the city, right? The city of Antwerp got 100 millimeters of rain. That doesn't mean that there's 100 millimeters of rain everywhere, on top of the buildings, on the side of the buildings, in the streets, in the little rivers or canals in the streets. Rather, water flows into what is called the basin of attraction. In other words, water flows into where the attraction is the biggest. And in this case, attraction is just I can't find the word, the force with which the earth attracts matter. So it tends to go flowing matter like that tends to flow to the lowest basins, right? So a basin of attraction is, in physics terms, is just the place towards which things would tend to move. So similarly, in physics and in biology and in cultural phenomena, things could potentially emerge randomly. And sometimes they do, but quite often you see them drawn to these basins of attraction. You see them drawn towards some position rather than another position. I'll try and give examples in a moment. I just want to first explain. So Deacon, for instance, says that an attractor is a region within the range of possible states that the system can find itself out in. So it's important that you understand that an attractor isn't a line or a point. It is a region. It is a possibility space, and within that possibility space, not everything is necessarily similar. There could be, so let's say water flowing in a stream. The middle of the stream might be stronger, or if it goes around a turn, the one side of the stream might be stronger, the other side might be slower. Depending on how many rocks are underneath, the turbulence in the water might differ. So the water still flows within that river, but it's not a uniform flow. And I think if we start thinking about cultural processes in these terms, it might give us interesting perspectives to think about. Right. So you would probably have seen pictures of what is called strange attractors. It looks like a butterfly's wings, where the and this comes from meteorology, where you can model the flow of processes within a range. So let's say you model them with lines, right? The lines will be within a space like this, but it will not be exactly the same lines all the time. So it's all over the place within that space, right? So this is the idea of at the edge of chaos. So there's some stability, you can see the pattern, but there's some instability. You can't exactly predict the pattern. The pattern will be somewhere within the range, right? And I think if we maybe compare translations, for instance, in terms of somewhere within the range rather than how do they differ or how are they similar, that might be useful. Obviously, as I said yesterday, constraints are the things that create these attractors. So they constrain the interactions in a system, and because not everything can happen, only certain things happen, and when certain things happen, that leads to only certain other things that can happen. I'll talk about trajectories in a moment to explain that to you. So the end state of any system, whether that be a physical or cultural system, would be a combination of determination and choice, or a determination and randomness, right? So at the edge of chaos, when you do research, you shouldn't be amazed if you find both of these things. We sometimes tend to find only the patterns and we ignore the outliers or the more chaotic stuff, or sometimes we just see the chaotic stuff, we ignore the patterns. And I think the theory of complex adaptive systems, complexity thinking, suggests that both of them would be in any system, or most systems, probably then. Right, so if you take a complex adaptive system and you don't just see it as a thing now, you see it as a thing that exists over time, then it means that systems, complex systems, emerge over time. They take place over time, and they are shaped in how they develop over time. So at moment zero, a complex adaptive system could have emerged in any number of directions, but it did not. Imagine you sitting in front of your desk with your computer closed, all the books closed, and you are free to think about something. That's moment zero. In moment one, there are probably 100,000 things that you can think of that could come to your mind. However, if I constrain your thinking by giving you a source text and saying, translate this source text for me, I limit the things that you can think about to probably then 1,000, right, out of the 100,000. So if this is a text about Hamlet, you will probably not think about the Hunchback of Notre Dame when I've put the text in front of you and when you start reading it. So you, as a complex adaptive system, then, or your thinking process as a complex adaptive system, then is kind of, by the context, which is now the source text that I've given you, by the science that you have to interpret, are limited. If I then further go and say, I'm giving you a scopus for this translation, and it should be a translation for inner city kids without parents, right? Then I'm limiting the trajectory that is left for you. I'm limiting that even further to probably 50 options, right? With meaning making and culture, it's never possible to have only one option from a sign. Only one possible meaning from a sign. That's always a number of options. And what we usually do is pragmatically determine which one is the most urgent or the most relevant now. And then you act on that. But the others are around about, are still around you. So let me just recap. At moment 0, you can think about 100,000 things. At moment 1, you can, because of the constraints, only think about 1,000 things. At moment 2, because of further constraints, you can only think about 50 things. And that is what a trajectory is the process that the system takes, the direction that the system takes, because of the constraints that influence it and that plays a role in it. So basically the route taken, and the route here metaphorically speaking, right? So trajectories are possible spaces over time, right? But they are not lines over time. So I want to reiterate that a line is a linear thing, right? And therefore it has a one-to-one cause and effect relationship. A point is not even linear, it's just a point, and therefore it has just it just exists in itself. What we have with trajectories is possible spaces that open up over time because of the constraints that are at play. And this means that the same outcome does not necessarily presupposes the exact same process. The same process could give, because of the complexity of the interactions, could give rise to different outcomes. But different outcomes could sometimes, or different processes could also sometimes give rise to similar outcomes. Not necessarily exactly duplicate, but similar. So this has been researched in psychology quite a bit, of how different patterns of doing things can still lead you to the same outcome. Let's say you want to be an international hockey player. Not all international hockey players go through the same routine of exercise and so on. They could have the same outcome by acting in different ways. So here is a example of how one could visualize trajectories. So let us take our example of me giving you well, first at the bottom left, the blue little arrow, you can see I've made the arrows fat, so they are spaces, they're not lines. So within that range of the arrow, there is room for a bit of difference. So it's a trajectory, but it doesn't mean that each time this trajectory emerges, it happens exactly the same, right? So let's say trajectory 1.0 is where you sit in front of your computer, you can think of anything, right? So then I give you at the arrowhead, I give you Hamlet by Shakespeare. That takes you into trajectory 1.1. In other words, you move in a particular direction. Then I give you the brief at the arrowhead of 1.1, and with that brief, some of you will interpret it in a certain way, and you will create maybe trajectory 1.2.1, which moves a bit off the given track or the suggested track, or you could create trajectory 1.2.2, which basically follows what you've done in the previous trajectory. So what you could do with this is to study processes of translation, either in a translator or across translators or in systems, it doesn't matter, and identify a moment 0. And as I think somebody asked yesterday, that is anyway a selection that you need to make. So you select a moment 0, and then you see what are the constraints on that moment. How does it constrain the process? How does the process go forward? What would be a next moment, a kind of a critical moment where changes are introduced, and what is the effect of that, and so you can carry on. You could have, after I've given you trajectory 1.0, you could have gone off the rails and saying, no, I'm not going to do this Hamlet nonsense. I think Hamlet is a colonialist story. I'm going to translate Hamlet as a dissenting story of somebody who went against the wishes of the king, somebody like that, right? So then you can go into trajectory 2, or you can go into a trajectory 3 at a later point. So my point here is just to show you that, and I have done some empirical work with this, that you could model trajectories and changes in trajectories in this way. And yeah. The third one, and I need to move on, the third one is again the question, what makes things to be? So it's causes that makes things to be. And I've already spoken to you about the billiard ball causality. But I've also told you yesterday that I think Piotr Blomczynski has framed this beautifully when he said that sometimes things are not caused by things bumping into another, but by the conditions being prepared by previous things. And this is a kind of a soft causality, which I think might be really valuable in translation studies. So rather than saying choices in the translation was caused by the ideology of the translator, I'm talking interlingual translation now. Rather than doing that, you could consider the ideology as something that conditioned the choices. But there might be other factors like personality or tiredness or irritability that also played a role, that also conditioned. So you cannot say it's one thing that caused the translation to be the way it is. A translation is conditioned through through a large complex of constraints. So this is the positive of Murphy's Law, right? Things happen because they can. And Stuart Kauffman, a physicist, biologist, has sort of talked about a causality of possibility, of things making possible the existence of other things. And we have spoken about constraints. Right. So I want to now, so this was epistemology. Where I want to go is to an onto epistemology. And to do that, I think biosemiotics gives us quite a solid conceptual background, because in biosemiotics, you study meaning making in living organisms. But in ecosemiotics, which is the development out of that, biosemiotics is taken further than just what happens inside a living organism, but to what happens between living organisms, which is the ecology. Typically, ecological studies would study the flow of energy, the flow of food, the flow of heat. In other words, material flows. What ecosemiotics does is it says, let's consider the communication in an ecosystem, the semiosis in the ecosystem that are required for the ecosystem to work. And the ecosystem is quite often dependent on communication between the parts of the system, the various members of the system. So if we say that society and culture emerge from matter, energy, semiosis in an ecology, then I would like to extend this argument into biology and say that society and culture emerges also from biology. In other words, a matter, energy, biology, semiotic kind of ecology, a complex kind of ecology. And for this, I'm basically using Calevi Kuls, is a famous biosemiotician and biologist, theoretical biologist. His 4-tier onto epistemology. So for him, world zero is a world without humans or Homo sapiens. Now, if you think about the world, it's according to scientific information, it's probably over 13 billion years old. And for only probably 500,000 years, there have been humans in this world. So world zero has been the state of our world for most of its existence. World one then is a world where humans interact with world zero. So this is where we stroke a cat, get wet in the rain, run into a, bump our toe against a brick or something like that. World two is when we turn our experiences into stories, where we use language, narrative reports, scientific reports, storytelling, these kinds of things, where we say this and this happened to me. And then world three for Kuhl is where we turn those narrative, language-based knowledge into aesthetic forms, like paintings and so on and so on. What I want to do is to extend this onto epistemology just by one level. So I think for me, it's important to say that world one, world zero, is the world of matter and energy only, because for a long time, of the 13 billion years, there was no life. So I think it helps us ontologically to say that the growth, the emergence of material conditions that were conducive for life took a very long time. And therefore, they are important also ecologically, because if they're not there, life wouldn't exist. So world zero for me then would be matter and energy. World one would be living matter and energy. And then world two would be the interactions with both world zero and world one, and world three and four, like Kuhl's suggestions. So this gives one a complex hierarchical onto epistemology that does not reduce any part of this universe of ours to any other part. So I'm not saying that aesthetics is actually just physics. I'm not saying that life is actually just chemistry. So I'm not trying not to reduce, but understanding that these worlds coexist and are nested into one another, and that we take part in all of them. And the important thing is that allows for the existence of different others, right? And I think allowing for the existence of others on their terms is probably one of the crucial points that we are battling with. As I said yesterday, when it seemed like octopuses have feelings and can interact and are intelligent, all of a sudden people stopped eating them. But what about, firstly, what about eating cows and pigs that are quite intelligent things? That's one question. But the other one is if we think that we should only value things because they are somehow like us, then we haven't understood otherness yet. And I think what I'm trying to do here is to build that into the thinking, right? So my worlds look like this. So world zero is the world of matter and energy. World one is the world of life. But as you can see, I've colored the whole world zero in red. So world one is basically nested in and embedded in world zero. It is world one, the world of living things, is also at the same time a world of matter and energy. So they are different from one another, but they also share similarities with one another. World two would then be the world of human interaction with worlds 1 and 0. World 3 would be where we create our narratives, our use of language. And once again, you can see that language is still part of the material world. It's nested in the biological and the material worlds. And the same for world 4, which is the world of aesthetics. And they interact with one another. Right. So the big question I think that the translational onto epistemology needs to look at is how do others co-constrain our thinking? So in constructivism, there isn't much focus on the other. I construct meaning. I'm in the creative, agential seat when I create knowledge. I think that we need a kind of a onto epistemology where we can explain how our knowledge is co-constrained by the things that we know, even if they are not other humans, even if they are rocks and water and things like that. And John Deely has worked this out over many books in what he calls semiotic realism. And it's semiotic because it's about making meaning of things, and it's realist because it takes the things that the meaning are made of very seriously and try and explain it as far as possible. Now, just to be sure, this is not a return to positivism, because Deely says it's impossible to say where matter and energy ends and where semiosis started, because they're just entangled. So it's not a matter of going back to some positivism or going back to some kind of reductionism. It is a kind of constructivism that takes the knowledge of the thing, that takes a thing about which knowledge is constructed seriously. Timo Moran adds to this argument when he uses Charles Peirce's work. Charles Peirce says that every representative or sign vehicle, which is what we generally call a sign, that these things refer to objects. But he also says that objects, and objects can be ideas, but they can also be real things in the real world, right? Material things like a rock or a dog or whatever. So somewhere Peirce also formulates this point that objects direct and define interpretations. Now, I think for me, that's a bit too strong. So I would rather say objects constrain or co-constrain interpretations, in the sense that they also play a role. The hardness of a rock somehow has to constrain my thinking about the rock. If I think it's a soft thing and I can run into it, then I'm mistaken, because the rock objected, as Latour said, right? So I think in a biosemiotic realism, which is a bit further than Deely's realism, semiotics always takes place through the body of a living organism. And what I then get to is a kind of translational ecology where the physiosphere, in other words, the world 1 and 2, 0 and 1, the biosphere, world 2, and the symbolosphere, worlds 3 and 4, are heterarchically embedded and entangled with one another. And they coexist and co-constrain one another. And this translation ecology is something that we've worked out in translation studies between languages, right? So there was a point where people would say, but this language is better than that language. This language is more expressive than that language. This language can do more than that language. With cultural relativity and the cultural paradigm, we've come to the understanding that languages are different, but that doesn't mean, that's not a value judgment. It doesn't mean that one language is better than the other, right? So what we were able to understand and explain with translation, interlingual translation, is that languages can exist in their own right, be what they are. They don't have to become another language to make sense, but they can be translated into other languages. So as much as each sphere, like languages, exist in their own right, each sphere also exists in an ecology where they co-constrain each other. So this symbolosphere, the world of aesthetics, doesn't live independent from the physiosphere. They are nested in one another and they co-constrain one another. So I think that translation in this kind of ecology is one of the factors that allow for differences to exist and for these things to coexist at the same time. So they can be They can be different, but they can still be linked to one another because we translate between them, right? So there are semiotic relationships between them in addition to these matter-energy relationships. Translation then is the negentropic biosemiotic work that we do in the organisms, in the ecology. And they do this, and I'm not yet sure how to formulate this, over and above or through the matter-energy existence, right? So again, the meaning-making processes that we study are at the same time material processes in an ecology. Translation, I think, as this wonderful quality that it doesn't delete difference for similarity, but keep differences not solipsistically isolated, but in ecological dialogue. I want to close by suggesting an ecology of onto epistemologies. So if you would just bear with me, we've now tried to explain how we know the world, what could be a good epistemology to know the world around us, which is what I suggested, complexity. And it's not the only one, and there may be others that are better. Then we've looked at, but what is our relationship to this world? What is the ontology? How do we think this world is? What do we have as an ontology? How is this world, and how we relate to it? So that got us onto epistemology. But there are many onto epistemologies. You would have materialism as one. You would have spiritualism as one. You would have the Western scientific paradigm as one. You would have indigenous religions or cosmologies as one. You would have the monotheistic religious, the three big monotheistic religions as cosmologies. And what has happened is that these are usually mutually exclusive. They are incompatible with one another. You cannot just say, okay, they've got this in common and therefore they're actually pretty much the same. It's pretty much like different languages. They cannot be harmonized, if I can put it that way. So the solution to that has been recently the pluriverse, right? So let all these possible worlds and possible explanations of the world exist, and let them be. We don't want one universe. We can live in a pluriverse with different views on what exists and different ontologies and so on. The problem with this pluriverse thing is that solipsism remains the problem. So if I'm a materialist and you are a spiritualist, I sit in my little corner, you sit in your little corner. We are happy each with our views, but we never talk to one another because we are self-contained. We are happy with what we are. So what I'm suggesting is let us consider these onto epistemologies as an ecology, which entail things that are different, but those differences doesn't mean that they are completely separated. They are linked through translational processes, and that is semiotic work, and that is hard work, and that is something that we pretty much don't know how to do. How to link not only onto epistemologies, but also disciplines. How to link them, how to make them talk to one, how to help them to be able to talk to one another. Right? So let us then, I'm closing, let us consider the task of the translator to make mutually incomprehensible onto epistemologies dialogue and understand each other to the extent that it's possible, and I assume that it's not completely possible. Thank you very much. I'm now going to stop sharing, and then there will be time for questions.
Thank you so much, Cobus, and exactly on time. Indeed, we have time for questions now. I'm sure there are some burning questions. let's open the floor. Does anyone have any questions for Corvus?
Please. Okay, there's one in the chat. I need to get my glasses. Okay, I'm trying to understand your question. So let me take the first part. If we examine a story's trajectory within retranslation context as it is under the impact of constraints, can we understand both the author and translators of various formats of retranslations as one of the constraints for each trajectory phase of the story? So yes, I would say retranslations would actually give you a very nice and simple way to do these trajectories. So there was the first process of translation, then a text was created, which was a kind of a marking the end of that process, and then the process is taken up again through a retranslation, and then the process is again taken up through a retranslation. So yes, each time, each retranslation would, I would suggest a trajectory, but what would be interesting is to compare the trajectories of the retranslations and then try and construct a general trajectory, and whether you can see whether each of the retranslations, did they mostly go in the same direction or did they take different directions? So let's say a translation of Hamlet that translates Hamlet as a gay man, or a translation of Hamlet that translates him as a straight man, right? So those would be two different trajectories, but they might have things in common that you can also study. So I think what the trajectory notion helps us with is to look at both similarities and differences in how these historical processes play out, right? So I think it's indeed true that each of the translations, as much, and the author, would be a constraint. I mean, it would be also interesting to look at the author as a constraint. I suppose that as you go into more retranslations, the author becomes a weaker constraint all the time. Or, on the other hand, you might get a translator who says, no, you've strayed too far from the source text. I'm going back to study the author and do a translation that justifies the author, right? So those are all kinds of patterns that can happen, but each one happens under certain constraints, and constraints could be choices that translators, authors, patrons, publishers, that they make. So the second part of your question, if so, does this suggest that the debate on translator as non-author can be reconceptualized since both the author and retranslators are outside of the meaning? I'm not sure what you mean here. Could you maybe explain?
Yes, and my question is that since following the logic of the author is dead, so that means that once the literature is created, its meaning is to be discovered by the readers, and we have the premise that the author can be conceptualized as a kind of weak constraint to the story, right? And we all know that readers or translators as readers, they are the kind of strong constraints to the story. And if we consider that the story has its own totality, it has its own agency, and the author only provides, because the author only use verbal signs, they can only provide a perspective to know that story. But when we consider those translations with translators with different ideologies or purposes, as well as when they are using different science and models to produce adaptations, so like there's three different agents with individual agencies. That's the author, the story, and the translators. And in this case, the translators and the authors are conceptualized as a constraint equally to the story. So in this on this premise, can we say that because the author and the translators are both constraints, they are outside of meaning. They only provide like a kind of direction of the story, but they cannot totally determine the meaning of the story. Does this say that it will be in vain to discuss like translatorship or authorship or translator as author or not, because they are out of the story, out of the meaning. They are parallel or equal. I'm not sure if I have explained this clearly.
I think you've explained it clearly. Whether I understand it clearly, that's a semiotic problem. So firstly, I would not use a phrase like the author or the translator is outside of the meaning, because I wouldn't know what that would mean. Meaning is always constructed relationally by some kind of agent in a relation to semiotic material, whether that be observing a rock or thinking about a unicorn. So I don't think there's something like, in semiosis, there's something like outside of meaning. I also think that you probably have a number of assumptions about from literary theory about authors and stories, because yes, I know the author has been declared dead, but I think the author has also later been again declared alive. Not in the same way as a final determinant, but as somebody who constrains a process. Yes. So also, I'm not sure whether I would agree that a story is an agent. I know it's debatable, but within a biosemiotic conceptualization, I keep agency for living organisms. The story, as it emerges, obviously constrains the further development of the story. So if you have a family with a father and a mother, the kind of logical next step is to let them have children, right? So there's this kind of the situation A leads to situation B, or not leads to, but makes it possible, right? So I'm not sure whether I would talk about the story as an agent, but definitely for me, the author and the translator are agents. Let's say, if you want to use a more neutral term for all of them, I would say authors, the story, and the translator are constraints. That might work, rather than calling a story an agent. Also, whether the author is dead or alive, the meaning still has to be created. The fact that an author, whether you, and I'm not saying physically dead, but whether you consider the author as a constraint or not, you still have to construct the meaning. It's not that if you take the author as that you can take the author as the determinant of the meaning. Even if they determined as hard as they could what the meaning should be, people will interpret it differently. People can interpret it differently. So in that sense, I think the author and its role in the process is one of the constraints, and the interpreter or the reader and its agency is another one, and their context would obviously be another one, and one can imagine a number of constraints. So I'm not exactly sure that I answered the question, but I think that's the best that I can do now.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
Wonderful. If you'd like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand icon, and let's keep the questions oral so that we have a record of what the question was on the recording. The next question is from Luc.
Yeah, if there's anyone from the students, go ahead. Now I can wait. Is there anyone else? No? If not, then yeah, thanks, Cobus, for this very broad view on on, to use your terms, stuff and matter. I know that translation studies is not ecosemiotics, of course, but it's interesting in that you have very clearly shown how many common grounds there can be, and how many parallel views there also can be. When I look at it from the perspective of translation studies, I see, of course, a lot of things that have happened and that show similarities over the past half a century, I would say. You talked about the cultural paradigm, cultural relativism, difference and difference. We have talked in translation studies a lot about that over the past decades. I was a bit surprised in that sense that at a certain point you said translation studies is too much focusing on agents, because well, sociology of translation is a subfield that I know quite well, where I think it is very much about constraints, about complexity, about non-predictability, and that kind of things. And especially with agents, it is very explicitly in a lot of case studies over the past decades on the human and the non-human that is explicitly included in agency as well. So I think what you called emergence, I do think there are a lot of common grounds with what we used to call dynamics, I think, or are still calling dynamics. In complexity, it is a lot about what we used to call irregularity. Patterns, well, we very clearly said it are not really patterns, but regularities, and non-stable components are very important there. So that we do since the systems theory, since the 70s and 80s in translation studies. So all these non-objective approaches that are very important in translation studies since 40, 50 years, the relative causality, the conditionality is also included there. I think a lot of that gets together in the sociology of translation, and that's why I was a bit surprised that you said translation studies is too much focusing on agents, because I think that agency concept is a very complex one itself.
Yes. So let me try and explain why I say that, because in a lecture you sometimes have to use shorthand because you cannot explain everything. So thanks for the question and for me to try and explain it. I think that my criticism would be, let's say, a restricted kind of criticism. I think with there's something called the translator turn in translation studies, which is driven by people like Douglas Robinson, again, Anthony Pym, Andrew Chesterman wrote about it, and so on. And I think they are right in saying that the translator is to be a factor to recognize with in cultural translation studies, sociological translation studies, ideology studies. I mean, Mona Baker and Maria Timoshko has written about these things, I think. what I do think is two things. The one is that the studies typically, and I might again I haven't read everything in translation studies, but many of the studies choose, let's say, important figures and important events to highlight agency. So agency is a kind of a valorized thing. The bigger the changes you can make, the bigger agent you are, right? And I think a lot of what happens in the world around us is that small little actions which are not necessarily even seen as agentive and which is not necessarily ascribed or are not ascribed as agentive, sometimes just through habit, you miss many of them. I can use an example. So in the 2013 book, I referred to I started thinking about these things. Then I said that not all translators are these agents of the Gandhi and the Mandela and the these level. Sometimes you just have, and I use the term in the proverbial, the translator in their proverbial stuffy office, slaving away at very mundane translation tasks. That they are should also be considered agents, and they are actually playing a really constitutive role. Douglas Robinson took me to task for that in a brutal way, saying that I'm disgracing the field of study. But I think that is indicative for me of a line of thought in translation studies that valorizes large agency events, and that typically do not study in, let's say, the informal economy, the everyday things that happen. So that's the first thing, and I agree with you that there is some of it. My argument is that I think there are still places where that doesn't happen. The other thing is that I think that even in sociology, the focus has shifted to agency more than structure, right? And in other words, I don't see studies, and maybe I don't read enough sociology of translation, but I don't see studies that talk about the self-organization of translation systems. It's and I mean, it's not wrong to study these emergent systems through their agents, but there's also another perspective, and that is that pinpointing the agency is not necessarily that easy. To come back to Latour's use of agency, I think, and here people would also differ from me, they do. I think agency in Latour is specified sociologically. It's not a general agency. It's the agency of things in the emergence of a society, right? So in that sense, if you use Latour's sense, you can talk about the agency of immaterial things. I'm probably rallying a bit against vitalist ideas, for instance, Karen Barrett, and I think even in the Echo translation group, people would have strong vitalist ideas where non-living things are regarded as alive and as having certain live features. So I think it's a. I agree with you. Thanks for raising it. I think it's probably more complex than I am able to. So I gave a broad overview, but I still do think that I'm taking probably a bit of a different look at agency than the field would do. And as I said yesterday, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, time will tell. There's another hand up. Uyama.
Please go ahead, Uyama. If you have a question, you can use your microphone. Please. Maybe it's a phantom hand.
Yeah, or otherwise there's a sound problem. Maybe you can type. I will read the question out if you can type it. Yeah.
Okay, there's a sound problem.
Yeah. Okay, you can type it while we wait for more questions.
While we're waiting for the next question, Cobus, and we can talk about it tomorrow. We'll have lunch together tomorrow. I do think that these smaller things you were referring to, these minor things, that they are taken into account in irregularities, in trajectories, and so. But okay, that would lead us too far here. So
thank you, Luc. Yeah, yes, take it to lunch tomorrow, and let's give the word to Reine.
Okay. Thank you, and sorry, Oyama, to go before you. Yes, perhaps still one thing about the irregularities, but why do we then call them irregularities? That's for me the difference with complexity studies. But anyway, we should do that another time. I have, in fact, two questions. One very specific, I think, about the different worlds. And my question there, very straightforward, would be why call world 2 the language world, just to summarize? Isn't there a linguistic bias? That's my question. And then I have a very general question, and you might leave that also for another time. In the end, you said we need to make mutually incomprehensible ontologies. We have to make them talk to each other. Could you give us a start? How you do that, or how to do that?
Okay. So in terms of language, I don't think including language in an ontology represents a bias. If it's situated in its place, in its position, I don't see it as a bias. What you do raise is that I could maybe in my conceptualization clarify that the interaction between world 0, 1 and 2, in other words, where humans interact with the material world, that is already semiotic. And that language, and Deacon writes about this, language is built upon those more basic semiotic interactions, namely the iconic and the indexical formats. So thanks for pointing that out. I can maybe make that clearer. But I don't think it is possible for human beings to consider an ontology where language plays no role.
Okay. So let's say images or other things are in world 1. I forgot about the world.
Well, I think it's a relational thing that world 2 is where humans, that's Calevi tries to explain, this is where humans engage with world 0 and 1, in other words, matter and life. And that engagement is not necessarily linguistic. That could be pre-linguistic. Okay. So it could be embodied, affective, iconic, indexical, and I agree. My schema doesn't show that clearly. I should make that clear. It's a good point. The second one is much more difficult. Well, I think one of the things that I did was that collected volume about translation beyond translation studies, where I asked people from different fields of study, mathematics, computer science, biology, business studies, law, and various aspects in humanities, to say what they think, what they mean when they use the word translation. In other words, what do they translate? And hopefully things like that would start creating a bit of a joint vocabulary, because I think part of our problem is vocabulary, that we don't know exactly how to talk to one another. But I mean, you find this problem not only between, let's say, cosmologies or larger lines of thinking. You find it between disciplines. You find it between, even within streams in a discipline. So if the complexity people and the sociology people talk to one another, like you've seen happen, there's always some kind of gaps in how we look at things and how we explain things. And I think part of it is inevitable because of the fractured nature of meaning making. But I think a translational ecology would kind of ethically suggest to us never to give up trying. I think work like that of Karen Bennett, who works on epistemic translation, linking epistemic systems, knowledge systems to one another, could be valuable. I think Michael Cronin's work on eco-translation studies, how humans and animals, for instance, interact, causes at least discussion between people from the natural sciences and humanities. At my own university, I have not yet been successful in engaging very well with natural science people. I don't know. But Zaini, for instance, has a group now, eco-humanities group, she and one of our philosophers, that they are running on a monthly basis with philosophers and biologists and art people and all kinds of people talking together. So I think this is a slow process of keeping on translating. But a quick answer I don't have.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so Uyama's question in the chat box is, I wanted clarity related to biosemiotic realism. I might have missed it, but I wanted clarity on semiotic realism and how it relates to translation. Right. That's actually a pretty good question with quite a long answer, which I will try to not take too long. One of the problems with how we see translation is that we assume systems of meaning, like source text, that gets translated into other systems of meaning, like target text, right? For me, if you want to go down to the bottom line, you also need to explain how systems of meaning are created in the first place. I've written a paper in which I've argued this, that, for instance, Douglas Robinson assumes the existence of semiotic systems, and he then explores inter-epistemic translation. So how is one semiotic system translated into another? I think the basis of semiosis is where we engage with world one and world 0 and world 1, and create meaningful relationship with that world, right? And that is what I mean by semiotic realism. It is meaning making is not only the translation between existing signs into other signs, but it is the creation of signs in the first place, right? And that process of observing something that I've never seen or observed before is also a translation process. I have in Peircean terms the representamen, and I need to find an object for that representamen, and I need to translate those into an interpretant, in other words, into a meaning. So there's a semiotically speaking, there's a translation process even in that, even in the pre-linguistic interaction with worlds 0 and 1. Uyama, I hope that helps you. We can talk about that when I'm back home. Uyama is one of our honor students, so it's nice to see her here. There's also Leon. Jack, I don't know whether we still have time. You be the boss.
We have time if you have time, and anyone who needs to move on is free to leave. But I don't want to interrupt the trajectory.
You've listened, hey? And it shows. So, Leon, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your enlightening lecture. I have a simple question, actually. I think it would be fast. Regarding the application of concepts like attractors and constraints in translation. To use an example, when the translator is working on a text, would it be correct to, can we understand that to consider that internal factors such as their personal interests or prior knowledge as attractors that influence their choices, whereas in contrast, would external factors like the intended target audience and the project deadline maybe be considered as constraints that they must work within?
Yes. So I think the quick answer is yes. I think Bourdieu has already given us some tools to think about the internal things. So the habitus is the way in which somebody has been socialized, right? And that is a particular constraint. I have a PhD student now who is studying 3 different versions of Confucius's, 3 translations of Confucius's Analects by sort of looking at how the 3 different translators had different what is the not field habitus, different habituses, right? So yes, I think the theory of constraints would predict that anything can be a constraint. You could even have something like low blood sugar as a constraint. You could have, I mean, there's been studies, for instance, about the Afrikaans author André P. Brink, who self-translated his works, and how when he translated from English into Afrikaans and when he translated from Afrikaans, so he would write in Afrikaans, translate into English. The next day he would write in English, translate that into Afrikaans, right? So it happened like that. And how there were different patterns. So just the constraints that the language in which he thought and in which he had to express himself constrained the translations. So, and definitely the brief, what the commissioner expects of you, the amount of money you're getting paid for a job will be a constraint. If you get paid too little, you will do a lousy job of the work, probably, unless you're a really goody two-shoes, right? And the target audience, the target culture, the target society, the pragmatics of that. So I think and this is obviously where people have pointed out that if you think about complexity or if you have to think about translation from a complexity perspective, you have to think about everything, right? And I don't think that's the implication. I think if you start off by understanding the complexity of the relations and then still pick out for the study certain relations that you will study and at least then choose more than just one course for those for the thing that you are studying, then I think we're already moving a little bit into something like a complexity approach to doing our studies.
Thank you very much. That is really
Pleasure.
helpful. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you for your lecture.
Pleasure.
Okay, do we have any final burning questions? Otherwise, we can refer those questions to the tutorials, perhaps.
Yeah, and if people wanted to email me, they're more than welcome to email. Is it a hand?
I think it's a hand. Maxime?
Maxime?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was honestly fascinating. I think I'll spend the rest of the day thinking about this in a good way. And I was just, I really connected with what you said about how we shouldn't, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but that they shouldn't only understand or maybe make meaning of things when we understand them or when we're the same as us. And I think especially in an ecology perspective, that's so important. Also in preservation contexts. And I was kind of wondering how, as maybe this is a bit abstract or too broad, but like as translators or the position of translation studies, how do we sort of prevent that we in order to make sure that we understand the other object or the thing we're trying to understand, that we don't maybe apply human language that shouldn't be applied to non-human entities. So for example, anthropomorphizing or and I was wondering, would acknowledging the co-constraints or the constraints, would that be a way of, and sort of maybe embracing those constraints, would that be a way of mitigating those risks, or in what kind of dynamic would we see between them?
I think so, yes. I think that, so remember I said that I think complexity thinking is a kind of a perspective that we take on the data that we work with or the world that we study. And I think taking the otherness as an assumption to start with, and starting the process with I am not the constructor here. I'm not the God in this relationship. I'm not the sole agent, I think, in this relationship. There is another, if we would call them agents, or another constructor in this relationship, because the relationship is always have two terminals, right? At least. Sometimes it's more complicated than that. But a relationship can never consist of one thing only. So by assuming from the very beginning that the knowledge I'm creating about a rock or a bacterium or a tree is a relational thing where the tree co-constraints. In other words, I have to allow, let's say with a tree, I have to allow my senses to be influenced and my thought process then to be influenced by what that tree is. I think that's the ideal, I think, to which I'm working, is that so what I'm doing is I think I'm taking the insights that translation studies have given us, and that is that different languages can remain different, but we find ways of linking them, connecting them, translating between them. In the same way, let's say the language of a rock, the language of a tree, and now I'm anthropomorphizing the semiotics of that rock, the semiotics that emerges out of me relating to a rock needs to include the rock as much as it needs to include me. Otherwise, I'm a dominating bastard who just enforce my construction on that rock. And a rock should be important because it exists, not because it has feelings or because it is alive or whatever. It doesn't have to have any of these features. Because it exists, I think it's important. I just quickly want to say, a philosopher recently made me aware that Heidegger apparently had this term, and my German isn't good, Gelassenkeit, which meant let things be, just let them be the way they are, right? Now, obviously for somebody who supported the Nazis, that is a bit of a strange thing for him to have said. But let's forget about the Nazis for the moment. I think what we want is a kind of a maybe an ethics or onto epistemological position where we allow other things to co-construct us and we co-construct them. Yeah, so I think that's it's really difficult to do that, and obviously we always construct. I'm not denying that we as living organisms construct, but I think what we would want is to explain how we are co-constructed or how we are co-constructing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. Thank you so much.
Jack, I don't follow the reference to the Beatles.
Oh, the Let It Be song.
Oh. Okay.
I can't. I wish I could sing it for you, but we need a drink for that.
Yeah.
So I do think it's time for me to step in. We couldn't have expected where this Q&A would take us, but it was quite enlightening, and I hope we've got a lot of things to think about as we move forward. So thank you very much, Cobus, for an excellent second chair lecture, and we can conclude day 2, I think, with this. A quick look at the schedule for tomorrow. I think there's only one live event tomorrow. You'll all be busy with tutorials and reading and other things on your own time, but it's the Q&A with Sara Ramos Pinto. If you haven't seen the webinar yet, do watch that. And I believe the Q&A starts at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, so which I'll be in. I'll see you there as well. So we'll see you bright and early tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Cobus.
Bye. Sleep well.